Usually we like to hear you got this, but not always. Let me ask you to stand if you are able for the reading of God's Word from Luke chapter 15, 11 to 32. A story you've heard often, but think about it in terms of fathers, because that's what I'm preaching about today, becoming a father who honors God. Jesus continued, there was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." And so he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had and set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. And he longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' And so he got up and he went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. And he ran to his son and threw his arms around him and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick! Bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing, and so he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother's come home,' he replied, 'and your father's killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' And the older brother became angry, and he refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me even a young goat I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you were always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'" You may be seated. This is a special day, especially for fathers. How many fathers do we have here? Let's see the hands. We have several, not a majority of the congregation, but several. And I'm pleased to be a father, and actually I've got a special treat for myself lined up at the 11 o'clock service. My wife Linda is taking a vacation day from her work at Columbia Baptist, and she's coming with both of our daughters, Kristen and Jacqueline, to the 11 o'clock service. So I'm especially excited about that, and then they're going to take me to lunch, I think, afterwards. Although probably I'm treating, that's just sort of how that goes. If you're a dad, you understand what I mean. It's okay, I'm glad to treat. If I get to have my girls here, I'm happy to treat any possible time. It's a good thing. Done a lot of reading about Father's Day this week. One of my favorite stories that I've come across was told by James Dobson in Bringing Up Boys. He quotes the story of a man named Dave who was born in Washington State in 1952, so a baby boomer. This is what he was like as a little boy. He said, "A friend and I found a coffee can of gasoline in the garage and decided to pour some down a manhole, light it, and see what would happen." Sounds like a good idea, right? Boys do stuff like this. We popped the manhole open, poured some gas in, and replaced the cover so that it was ajar. We kept throwing matches down, but nothing happened. So we poured all the gas in. Finally, there was a noise like a jet engine starting up, and then a big boom, and the manhole cover flew up, and flames shot about 15 feet in the air. The ground was rumbling like an earthquake, and the manhole cover crashed about 12 feet away in the neighbor's driveway. What had happened was the gas ran down the sewer lines for a block or so and vaporized with all the methane in there and blew up all our neighbors' toilets. I'm a plumber now. That's how I know exactly what happened. Now, I got to raise girls, so it wasn't quite the same. But this weekend, Friday evening, Linda and I met two good friends of ours from Virginia Beach. They came up, we all went to dinner. But first, we met at their daughter's house in Arlington. Their daughter, Bryn, is an accountant, but about 20 years ago, she was what we called our summer daughter. Her mom was working full-time, and my wife, Linda, was a stay-at-home mom at that point, and so Bryn Parker came and stayed with us for the whole summer. I mean, she'd sleep at home. They just lived across the street. But she stayed with us during the day, each day, and we called her our summer daughter. So we've always felt close to Bryn, and she has a little boy of her own now named Parker. Used her maiden name for his first name. And so we stopped by her house and met Susie and Alan, and then got full to go down over in the little outdoor swimming pool they have, one of those little blow-up pools, and he had a case of, he had a little container for water, and he picked it up and poured it, thought that was pretty cool, and then he thought, what would it be like if I poured it on the dog? And so he just walks over and pours it on the dog. Of course, Mom says, no, don't do that. And then the next thing, he's getting stuff in the house and getting toys everywhere and throwing balls, and I mean, he's just sort of causing chaos, and we all are loving on him, and he gives you a hug, and then he goes and gets in more trouble. And it just reminded me of all the things that little boys do. And I'll tell you, I think I was probably a little boy like that. I don't think I was particularly bad, but I was very rambunctious. And I was blessed with a wonderful dad. Kurt Olson. Dad died in 1986, so he's been gone, 29 years now? I miss him still. And I think of all the things that my dad did with me when I was a little boy. Now, my mom was great too, but I'll have to talk about that on a Mother's Day. Today is the day for dads. And I think of all the stuff my dad did with me. And I remember when I was a little boy, I wanted to play baseball. So he would take me in the backyard and he'd pitch the ball to me, and I'd usually swing and miss. But eventually got to the point where I could hit some of those balls. And then after a couple years, I decided, the pitchers get to do a lot. They usually had me in right field. Any of you who know about baseball know what that means. You take the weakest boy and put him in right field. It's different with the major leagues. In the major leagues, they've got the outfielder with the best arm in right field. But on the little league level, no way. It's the boy that's the weakest goes out in right field, and that's where I usually played. And out in right field, where you can sit there all day and never have a ball hit to you, I decided the pitcher got to be involved in every single play. It starts with a pitcher, and so I told Dad, I want to be a pitcher. Now, I didn't have the genes to become, a Steven Strasburg, or I guess I really ought to switch names now, talking after last night. Scherzer wasn't my last name either. But when I told my dad I wanted to be a pitcher, he went out and bought a catcher's mitt. And in the backyard, he got that catcher's mitt, and as a middle-aged man, I'm sure the knees didn't feel too good. He squatted down and put that catcher's mitt right there, and we had a little plate we put in the backyard, and he said, come on, Mark, throw it right here. So often my fastball dropped down, hit the ground, and bumped up, hit his shins, or got past him and went in the shrubs we had behind where we played, and he had to go fish it out from the shrubs. But he did that because his little boy wanted to be a pitcher. And so he wanted to do whatever it took to make it possible for his little boy to have a chance to try to be a pitcher. Dads are wonderful. If you've got a good one, treasure him. They're getting more and more rare in our society. There was a Christian man named Bill Glass that used to have a prison ministry. He said as he talked with inmates in the prison, he said it was very rare to find one who had a good relationship with the Father. In fact, there was a greeting card company that came to the prison on Mother's Day beforehand, and they said, we're going to do a special present to all those in prison. We're going to give you a free card from our company, of course, but we'll even provide the postage. You just show up at a certain time, we'll give the card, you write the note to your mom, give us the address, and we'll mail them all for you. And the line stretched all the way down the hallway and around the corner. Almost all the prisoners wanted to write a note to their moms. Well, somebody with the company said, well, why don't we do the same for Father's Day? So they put the big announcement, free cards for Father's Day. And they showed up to the same prison. Nobody came. They didn't want to send a card to their father. Some of them didn't even know who their father was or where he lived. And that's not absolute guaranteed proof that not having a father creates problems, but it really points to that reality. Kathleen Parker has written, she writes all sorts of columns, of course, and she's written a wonderful column in which she says, my decades in the column business inform me that when I write about the wonderfulness of dads, write about paragraph 3, single moms start to get huffy, and alienated dads get teary. Single moms are heroic, our culture tells us, and any suggestion to the contrary is heresy, punishable by a suspension of sisterhood. Note that they are heroic sometimes, and sometimes not. And the point here is not to say that a mom can't be a good single mom, because she can. If you've got a woman that just does not have a husband there, there's no dad in place, God can step in, the church can gather around, and you can raise a child. Absolutely. But that does not mean that we should say, dads are really unnecessary. Who needs them? And there are more than a few in our culture. And watch most of the TV shows that feature dads. The great majority of them, the dad is either stupid or alienated, doesn't care about his kids. Even ones where it's a fairly happy family. There's not a deep relationship usually between father and children. I guess The Cosby Show was about the last one that featured something like a real serious relationship between father and children. Kathleen Parker goes on, she said it's simply easier to deal with the consequences of fatherlessness in America, to build more prisons, extend more welfare, track down deadbeat dads, and medicate distracted children, than to look ourselves squarely in the mirror. We're not suffering a bout of misguided thinking or benign neglect in these matters. Rather, the minimizing of fatherhood as an institution has been amply considered, and at least by some in positions of influence, fatherhood has been determined to be not that essential. This conclusion is so wrong as to be criminal. And I agree with her. And I have been blessed by different fathers, not just my own. Back in the Depression, when things were absolutely horrible and unemployment was 25%. None of us have ever seen that. Even the recent Great Recession, we didn't see anything like that. There were two dads that struggled with poverty. One was a first-generation Swede named Linné Olsson. He and his young wife, Bertha, had a dairy farm in Rice Lake, Wisconsin. And they got it up and going, and then the Great Depression hit. Milk prices came down each year. What they sold brought in less money each year. And finally the day came when the guy came to show up for the payment, the annual payment for the farm. They paid once a year back then, and they didn't quite have enough. And they lost their farm. I still remember my grandmother telling me this story. And my grandmother, who was the sweetest lady, got angry when she said, that Frenchman, sorry to any of you who are French, I know I'm not attacking all Frenchmen, but that Frenchman promised us. He wanted us to make a $1,000 payment every year, and we said $500 we were sure we could make, and he said, let's make it $1,000, and then if you have a tough year, I'll just take $500. And well, we finally had that tough year, and we had the $500, and he showed up, and we gave him the $500, said, I'm sorry, I need to have the $1,000. We didn't have it. He foreclosed on the farm. They went bankrupt. They lost the farm. And they took their 4 little children and put them on the back of a truck and drove all the way to Fairfax County, Virginia, out to Herndon, near Dulles Airport. Of course, there was no airport. There were just a bunch of cows out in Herndon back then. And there were, more importantly, dairy farms in Herndon. And my grandfather, Lene Olson, my daddy's dad, went to work as a laborer for other dairy farmers. I never got to know Lene. He died before I was born. But I imagine, like most men, there was a sense of pride, and I'm sure he was humiliated losing his dairy farm. Most men, we tie our self-worth into our success in our given careers. Going bankrupt is about as unsuccessful as a farmer can be. But he didn't cut and run. He didn't leave his wife behind. He didn't abandon the kids. He took them all out there to Herndon, Virginia. And he started working for other dairy farmers and saving his money, and finally saved enough to buy a little dairy farm. Not one of the big impressive ones, just a small little piece of land, just enough to raise the kids and get them to adulthood. And I'll always be grateful to that man, Lene Olson, for what he did. And then in western Pennsylvania, there was a guy, Jim Ashton. He was a coal miner. How many of you are hoping one day that you or your kids will grow up to be coal miners? Let's see the hands. Yeah, not high on the list, is it? And I heard stories about what it was like for him. Sometimes he'd have to go down in parts of the coal mine where they had 18 inches of water down there. It was usually about 55 degrees. You know what 55-degree water feels like? What's the word? Cold, really cold. And he'd have to sit in it all day long working in the mines. My uncles told me he would come home at times and at the end of the day, and his wife had the meal ready. There were 8 kids in the home. Can you imagine 8 kids? They had a 2-bedroom home. Yeah, you do the math. Husband, wife, 8 kids, 10 people, 2 bedrooms. Not a whole lot of privacy in that house, huh? But he didn't complain about it. But he got home from work when he'd been down in the water, and sometimes he would just say, I'm not ready for dinner yet. I'm going to go and slide back behind the little potbelly stove and sink down in the corner and sit there for about 30 minutes while his body warmed up. It had been so cold all day long in that coal mine. And I think of the things that Jim Ashton did so that his kids, including the youngest daughter, Nell, my mom, could have a chance to graduate from high school and go off and make a career for herself. And I did get to meet Jim Ashton when I was a little boy. He seemed like a very old man to me. He had a beard, smoked a pipe. And as a little boy, I wasn't so interested because he couldn't go out and play ball with me like my dad could or anything like that. You know, a whole lifetime in the coal mines doesn't make one want to get up and throw a baseball when you're old. But as I've looked back, I realize how much I owe to those 2 dads and the way they raised their families, even in the worst of the Great Depression when they had very little money, both of them very poor. And yet they put their families first. And I'm so grateful to it. They raised godly sons and daughters. And I was the beneficiary. How will I ever be able to pay back all that was given to me? Now, a lot of you have fathers like that or grandfathers, and if you do, today is the day to say thank you. I hope that you'll take your dad to lunch, or if he's far from here, that you'll call him up and tell him how much you love him. Maybe recount a story or two you remember from when you were little. If you've got a grandfather, it's time to make a phone call there too. I remember how excited I was when our little girls were born. Linda and I are blessed with 2 daughters. I was mortified when the oldest one, Kristen, got to about 2 years old. She really went through a stage when she liked her mom best of all, either the grandmother's next best, any of the neighborhood ladies next best, and I ranked only ahead of the postman. That was about it. And it was very obvious who'd she want to go and hug, who'd she want to play with. And I remember thinking, what did I do wrong as a dad? I know I go to work every day, but I mean, that doesn't make me a bad guy. But fortunately, we got past that stage, and we got to a stage when she wanted to interact with dads. And I remember when she came to me, and she asked if I could play Barbies with her. You know, I didn't have any sisters growing up, just my brother Kent and I. There weren't many Barbies around the house. And so I came up with a suggestion. I said, how about if you take Barbie, I'll take Ken. We're going to sit down, and we'll face each other, and we'll spread our legs out, and we're going to create a playing field, and I've got little goals, 2 of them, and I'm taking Ken, you're taking Barbie, and we're going to knock the ball back and forth and play Barbie soccer. That's what we're going to do. And I remember those times together. And if you talk to Kristen, who will be here for the 11 o'clock service, she can still tell you about Barbie soccer. I remember when I was driving the car, I was somewhere in the Virginia Beach area, and for the first time I heard a new Christian song, Butterfly Kisses. And I've got to be honest and tell you that as I listened to the words of that song for the very first time, the tears started coming down my cheeks. Walk beside the pony, Daddy. It's my first ride. I know the cake looks funny, Daddy, but I sure tried. And I thought about my little girls and all the special times we'd had together. There is nothing like being a dad. And I think that God has blessed us with a model to have fathers and, of course, mothers too. And I don't want to take anything away from mothers. And I got the best mother ever. She's just marvelous. But today we're focusing on dads. And we live in a society that doesn't value dads as highly as it ought. And I would just say, let's go back to a story that Jesus told about a father. Because although there's plenty of verses in the Bible I can pull out that are all very legitimate, have great insights, if I just want to pick one story that talks about dads, I think the parable, in my Bible it's called the parable of the lost son, and that's perfectly acceptable. NIV is a great translation, but on this one story, I really wish they picked a different headline. And you know, the headlines are added by modern scholars. That's not really part of the original Scripture text. I wish they called it the parable of the forgiving father, because I think the father is really the most important character in this story. And yes, you can certainly say, and theologically I completely agree with you, that this is ultimately about God and about what God is like, and that's absolutely true. But God chose to reveal an aspect of Himself through the story of a father, and then I think that tells us something about what fathers can be like. And in all my studies of the New Testament, what I've come to conclude is that this was not a story about a father that most of the people Jesus met with would have come up with on their own. This was not the story of about a typical Jewish father in the first century. In fact, I bet a lot of the listeners that Jesus had when they first heard it were shocked by this story, because most dads didn't behave this way. And I got to just even ask, I don't even think most dads behave this way today. I want you to think about this. When you were growing up, when you were 16 or 17, if you had gone to your dad and say, Dad, you know, you're going to die one day and I'm getting the inheritance. How about if I just get my part now? Would that story have gone well for you? I bet not. It would not have gone well for me with my dad either. I'll tell you, he loved me, but he would not have taken that request very well at all. But in this story that Jesus told about really God the Father, but using a human father as an example, the son comes to the father. It's the younger boy. Jewish rules at the time indicate the younger son gets a single portion. The oldest boy gets, some of you know, a double portion. That's the rule they had back then. And the younger boy comes and said, Dad, I want my share of the inheritance now. And for whatever reason, the father gives him his share of the estate. 1/3 of the estate value, he gives it to him. And the young boy is immature. Maybe he's a bit spoiled already, who knows. And Dad gives him the money, and what does he do? He goes off to a far country and he wastes all the money. Now, whether what the older brother later says is true or not, whether he spent it on prostitutes or not, I do not know. but he did not use it wisely. He didn't use it morally or ethically. He was totally self-centered, and he blew all the money. And then when all the money was gone, he is so desperate, and a Jewish boy has got to be really desperate to sign himself out and take a job with another farmer feeding what? You tell me. Say it louder. Pigs. He's feeding the pigs. How many of you like to grow up and be someone who fed the pigs? That high in your list of things you'd like to do? And for a Jewish boy, it's tremendously humiliating. It means he's perpetually unclean. And I don't mean just physically unclean. It's spiritually unclean to be feeding the pigs. It violates all sorts of Jewish kosher regulations. And he's so hungry. He thinks about eating the pods that the farmer put out for the pigs to eat. You've got to be really hungry to think about eating pods like that. And he comes to himself, it says. And he says, how many of my father's hired servants eat better than this? I'm going to go back home. And he's a Jewish boy. He knows the rules. He does too believe in God. He hasn't been living like that, but deep down inside, he knows there's a God. And he said, I'm going to say to my dad, Father, I've sinned against heaven. That's a Jewish way of saying God. I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And that's true. He is not worthy to be the son anymore. Make me as one of your hired servants. And he starts off going back to his father. And then the surprise of the story comes with the father. Because it says when the boy was still a long way off, the father saw him. And I think that means the father's looking down that road, waiting for that son to come. And the father runs to the son, and the Jews listening to this story must be saying, no, the father waits for the son to come back and apologize. But not in this story. That who told this story? Remind me again. Jesus told this story. The father went and ran to the son. And he throws his arms around the boy and gives him a hug. And the boy goes into his rehearsed speech. Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But he can't finish because the father interrupts. Quick, servants, bring the best robe for this boy. Bring the ring for his finger. Kill the fattened calf. We're going to have a celebration. What an amazing love the father has for that son. And the father's got another son. And he's disappointing in a whole different direction. Because he's been the good boy, he's been the good son, he's stayed home, he hasn't run off and wasted the money, he has been obedient to everything. But on this day, when he comes back to the house and hears the celebration and the music, and he asks a servant, hey, what's going on? Dave, tell me, what's happening? And Dave tells him, well, your brother's come home and your dad's having a big party to celebrate. And the older brother has an emotion. What is that emotion? You tell me. Anger and jealousy. He's furious. And he refuses to go in. Male pride kicks in. I am not going in that house. And again, who has to take the initiative? Who is it? The father. The father, again, takes the initiative, and he comes out of the house because he loves the older boy too. And he takes this insult from the older boy who talks about your son, never my brother, never our family member, just your son. And he takes that and he doesn't explode back in anger. He understands the older son's anger. And then when the older son says, you've never given me anything, he does correct him. And if you go back and look at the beginning of that story, when the younger boy asked for his share of the estate, it says the father divided his estate between them, plural. He's already deeded over the whole place to the older son. The older son owns the whole place. And the father said, everything I have is yours. What do you mean? What do you mean I've never given you anything? The whole place is yours. But we had to celebrate. because this, your brother, he's not just my son, he's also your brother. He was lost, and now he's found. He was dead, and he's alive again. And so the Father teaches us the lessons. And the best human fathers follow this model, loving their children, forgiving their children, teaching their children about God. And at their best moments, certainly they have worse moments and they stumble. I had plenty of times when I did that, but at their best moments, letting their children see a little bit of what God is like as they play the role of the loving Father. And that's God's plan. He created us to live with parents, with both fathers and mothers. Sometimes different situations require that we don't have a father or a mother, or we don't have both of them in place. But ideally, to have a father and mother in place is the very best thing. And we ought to hold that up as a church and be grateful. I'm delighted that you have called as a pastor Phil Fagg, who I have known previously and think highly of. And I understand he's got 2 children, right? Margot is one, and then the son Alexander, named for what city? Alexandria. How about that? You're getting a pastor who has a son named for your own city. That's impressive. And I pray and I believe with all my heart that he will set the good example of being a loving dad. And I pray that you'll reach out to his kids as well as his wife and make them all feel welcome. And that most of all, that as a congregation, we will covenant together to say we are all children of a loving Father. And as far as human fathers go, we want to honor our dads among us. And we want to raise up a new generation of young men to be loving dads, to care about their children, and be a congregation that highly values family and highly values the role that fathers play, as well as, of course, the role that mothers play. Hold them in balance, equally important before God. Now, my invitation always includes an offer for anyone to make a decision to accept Christ as Lord and Savior. And so I'll throw that opportunity out there today. There might be someone who's been visiting the church and been waiting for the church to call a pastor before joining. And if that's you and you already know Christ as Lord and Savior, maybe today is the day for you to come forward and to say, I want to become a member here at Downtown Baptist Church. I want to join the church right as a new chapter is starting for the church, a bright future. If you have any decision to make, I'll be here at the front. I'm going to ask Dave to come and the praise team to come and lead us with an invitation song.